In this presentation, we're going to look at an example of a moral principle, a principle for appropriate relations between people, which can be illustrated by classical realist logic, in other words, common sense logic. The question we're going to look at is, why is it bad to tell a lie? Most people are aware that telling the truth is a good thing, telling lies is a bad thing, but most of us at some point in our life have been tempted to tell lies and find it very convenient. In fact, there are a number of reasons why circumstances might seem that telling lies is a good thing. What we're going to be looking at is whether or not telling lies is objectively evil. And that is it a bad thing simply of its very nature? Now, to understand this, we have to understand natures a bit, but I don't want to go too far into that. Basically, a nature or an essence or a form, different words for the same thing, is the very design of the thing, its very fundamental makeup. So, for instance, the nature of water is to be wet. It can't not be wet at room temperature. Okay, if you make wet water really cold or do some other strange thing to it, you can turn it into a gas or a solid. But at room temperature, normal pressure, and so on, water is wet. That's the nature of water. And at room temperature, if it doesn't boil at 100 degrees Celsius, then you know it's not water. So it's something which is always true of water. What we want to do is see if we can find something with the same kind of scientific certainty with this question of telling a lie. What we're going to be doing is relying on a set of premises. In other words, statements that appear to be indisputable, or at least whose validity we're going to accept in working through this question. The first one is the idea, the statement, that humans are equal. And we can go into a lot of discussion about that, whether or not people with one leg are as human as people with two legs and things like that. But overall, we're going to say that anybody with 46 chromosomes and is basically born into the world through human parents, we'll call human, and we'll say that they have human dignity. An awful lot of political action around the world, such as Amnesty International, the objections to racism, and many other major political movements, social movements, have all been premised on this assumption, this statement, that humans have equal dignity. Whether you come from this country or that country, the colour of your skin, your religion, whatever, humans have equal dignity. That's a statement that we will say describes the nature of humanity. A second premise, a second statement, is that the contents of our minds are a part of us. So that I am in some way influenced or completed by the knowledge that I have. And so my knowledge, and we've already looked at what knowledge is, it's true statements about the world, it's a map that I carry in my mind of the world around me. And I'd say that map is a vital part of the way that I live my life. And the more complete that map is in terms of the extent of the things which it has under its control, has mapped, helps me to live my life better. There are really two aspects to the map. One is how far it goes, how many items are mapped, and also how precise it is, which parts of it are in error. And my goal, and I suspect your goal, most people's goal naturally, as we go through life, and we have a taste for learning things, is to pick up more and more bits of knowledge, in other words, bits of true understanding of the world around us. And so we'll say that our minds, the contents of our minds, are a part of us. The third objective premise, the third thing which we can say that appears to be quite indisputable, is that it is wrong to produce inequality between things that are equal. And so by this is really meant something that you would find in mathematics and geometry that if I have a big number and a small number, I can say that they are unequal. And if I have things which are equal in some sense, then artificially producing an inequality does in some way a violence to them. If I have two rocks, they're equal as rocks. If I have a dog and a rock, in some way there is a natural inequality there because the animal has life, the rock doesn't. And so producing an inequality, treating a dog like a rock, for instance, would be perhaps to kick the dog. I can kick a rock, I can throw a rock, but to kick my dog or throw my dog would be considered something which is improper because I'm treating the dog like a rock, treating it in a way which is below its dignity. So they're our assumptions. Let's move now to the question of communicating ideas, statements. All of the statements that we communicate are either things that we have observed in the world and mapped into our brains with true statements, or true statements that we've taken from our minds and uttered in some way, communicated in some way to somebody else as a statement which will then go into their minds and become a statement, a part of them. And so in this example, what we're looking at is a situation where somebody, the first person, makes an observation about the world that becomes a statement in their mind. In this case, there are apples in the tree. And from what we've seen of the notion of truth, that's a true statement, at least as far as the picture of the tree that we have there. If that person then communicates that statement that's in their mind to another person and tells the second person there are apples in the tree, then what's being communicated is a statement which does conform to reality. It's a true statement. And because it is the true statement in the mind of the first person communicated with accuracy to the second person, we would say that the first person is telling the truth. There is a proportion then between the first person and the second person. They have equal dignity. The first person observed something about the world, somehow learnt something, and then communicated that statement about the world, that mapping, to the second person, who now has the same knowledge, is again equal. Both of them are equal humans, and they now have an equality in terms of the statements about the apple and the tree. If that second person then turns to a third person and says, there are no apples in the tree, maybe they're a bit selfish and want them all for themselves or something, that second person has communicated to the third a statement which is known not to conform to reality. It doesn't have the benefit, the quality of truth. And so in the mind of the third person is a defect. The first and second people have the equality, the true mapping to the reality, so they have truth. The third person does not have truth. And so even though the third person is of equal dignity, is a human, the third person has been the victim of a conscious communication of an untruth. And so what forms in their mind is something which is untrue. In the case of the apples in the tree, they might miss out on having an apple to eat. If it was something more important, like are there trains on this train line, it might be something which might make the difference between life and death if you go about sitting on the train line or something or falling asleep on it. Are we looking here at the reasons between the first and the second people communicating? No, we're not. We're simply looking at the stuff of communication, which is statements about reality ultimately, and the nature of the people. And so regardless of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that they're communicating, Simply the nature of what is communicated is itself creating a disproportion and inequality. And because it's treating that third person who has equal dignity in an unequal way, in a way which is demeaning, it is naturally and always a bad thing to do. And so in this way, and if you go back and look at it, we can see that in all cases, telling a lie is naturally and objectively a bad thing because it demeans the listener of the lie. There are circumstances where we may not have to say anything, and that's quite a different category. And many of the objections that people say, well, it's okay to tell lies if someone's going to do something bad with the information. Well, the answer to that is very simply, don't say anything. There is no compulsion to speak, to communicate ideas. However, to communicate something which is known to be untrue, even if it's for a good purpose, is something which is naturally going to cause that disproportion, and therefore it is naturally a bad thing.